The rain had already started when Alexander pulled into the circular drive, windshield wipers swishing like a heartbeat against the glass. The estate looked like a sculpture softened by night. Black hedges, long white columns, the marble steps reflecting the streetlight in a sheen. He was 2 hours late, tired in the way men who had spent the day moving numbers felt, weariness that lived more in the scalp than the limbs. He imagined the hot water of the shower, the quiet of the study, a glass of something that tasted like solitude. He imagined his wife, Adriana, in silk, unimpressed by time or weather, waiting to trade the day's small victories. What hit him instead was a voice, high, lacquered with disdain, cruel in its casualness, cutting through the rain and the house like a blade. "You don't belong here." The sound made him brake without thinking. His hand knotted around the steering wheel. He listened as the sentence echoed in the foyer beyond the open doors, the clatter of a wheelchair, the sharp click of shoes on marble, a breath that sounded almost like a sob. For a moment he sat in the car as if someone had closed the world behind him. Then he thought of the shower and the whiskey and his tiredness and moved. He hadn't been home in a week. He hadn't expected argument, not tonight, not with rain like this. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the cavernous hall, damp wool of his coat leaving a dark print on the stone. Sound bounced off the walls here, a lamp clicking, the refrigerator humming from somewhere deep in the kitchen. He followed the voices, the way one traces a smell to its source, and hid behind a column at the edge of the main room, watching without meaning to. Adriana stood between the door and a small, frail woman in a wheelchair. Adriana's hair was impeccable, her blouse a smooth line of authority. The woman in the wheelchair had her scarf wrapped too tightly to hide her thinning gray hair. Her hands were gnarled, but the fingers moved with the careful dignity of someone who had once ruled a household with the economy of an efficient smile. Carmen, the housekeeper, hovered by the wheelchair like a shepherd protecting a lamb. Her apron was damp from the rain, and her face held the kind of patience that had been practiced through years of minor betrayals. She was saying something in a low voice. It sounded pleading and weary at once. Adriana's face was cold. She pointed at the woman as if indicating a piece of unwanted furniture. "You don't belong here," she said again with the ease of someone delivering a sentence she had practiced. Alexander felt as if someone had thrown a stone through his chest. He could not move. He would later remember how time rearranged itself in that instant, the paneling of the wall, the way the chandelier light smeared across the marble, the smell of boiled coffee from the kitchen. He would remember the picture on the wall, an old photograph of a man and a woman, eyes softened by love and sun, a young Alexander between them, and how that image fractured beneath this new one of Adriana delivering judgment on a woman he had not seen in years because he had told himself he could afford not to. He stepped out from behind the column because hiding had become impossible. Adriana turned as if expecting him, and then, for a beat, her expression flickered. It was almost pity, a faint, practiced expression that belonged to a woman certain of her role on someone's stage. She did not step back. She had prepared for his arrival, he realized. Everything here was arranged to demonstrate control. "Alexander," she said, with that cool politeness of someone reprimanding a child who had forgotten his place. "Now the whole thing makes sense." He looked at the woman in the wheelchair. Up close, the face was more familiar than he had admitted even to himself. The mouth had the same stubborn line as his own, the same stubborn set to the jaw. There were small crescent scars at the temples, like proof of childhood's scraped knees. His heart did something he did not know a heart could do. It doubled over with recognition and shame. "Mother?" The word came out small and brittle. The old woman looked at him and smiled like someone who had been holding a secret affection for a long time, the kind of love that didn't need to announce itself. Her eyes were still bright under the wear of years. "My boy," she said, and her voice carried the small, private world of lullabies and stories. That moment, the two syllables, was the hinge on which everything tilted. Adriana's smile thinned and turned into something sharp. "She is not part of our life, Alexander," she declared, as if reciting a policy she had written for his benefit. "She brings complications. She brings obligations. We have a future to build." The word future landed like a detonator. It was a word Adriana loved, a clean, forward-moving word that excused uncomfortable things on the altar of progress. Alexander felt for the first time in a long time a fracture in his own foundation. He had been busy building, someone else had been erasing. Carmen moved closer to the wheelchair and placed a hand on the old woman's knuckled fingers. "Please," she said to Adriana. "She's soaked. I brought her in from the taxi. I couldn't leave her out there. She said she was cold. I told her—" "You shouldn't have," Adriana cut in. Her tone suggested morality was an expense she could not be bothered to pay. "You shouldn't encourage this. People like that bring pity and then problems. We can't keep a charity case in our home." Alexander felt his mouth go dry. He thought of missing birthdays, his mother calling and leaving messages that a secretary had filed away as family, no action required. He remembered a blurred wedding day with an empty chair at the back of the church because some miscommunication had given his mother the wrong address. He remembered a pharmacy visit he'd forgotten until now, a time when his mother had been refused a card and it sat on a bench with the receipt in her lap like a confession. He had told himself explanations then, efficiency, oversight. He had been building his life. Someone else had been steadily erasing the person who had built his first life. "Adriana," he said, and found that his voice held a kind of brittle authority he hadn't expected. He was a man who had been kinder to contracts than to people in the last years. He had been taught to negotiate and to close. But this was not a business transaction. "She is my mother." "That makes it even harder," Adriana said, and there it was, the logic he hated more than the cruelty. "It means you can't see clearly. You owe her nothing. We owe our decisions to the future." "You owe her decency," Carmen said quietly. Her voice carried a history of small protests and big compromises. "You can be reasonable and kind at the same time." Adriana sneered. "How convenient for you to talk about kindness when you've been harboring her in basements and storerooms, Carmen. How noble." Carmen's face tightened. The implication burned. She had not been hiding Esperanza in a basement. She had been performing what greater men had neglected. She had answered the old woman's night calls, driven her to the clinic at dawn, coached her through the cards that were inexplicably declined. She had watched Adriana's decisions erode dignity with the same fierce protectiveness she had once reserved for her own family. She had done so because what else was there? The house needed someone to look after the soft places, and Carmen had stepped into those cracks. Alexandre felt something like an animal's rage. It was a private, raw thing that had been fed by years of small lies. "When did you tell me?" he asked Carmen. His voice wasn't accusatory. It was a question for which he had desperately needed an answer for too long. "Not in a way you'd hear," Carmen said. "You were swimming in work. You took calls through the meetings. She stopped coming to the table because—" Carmen's eyes flicked to Adriana, "because it made you uncomfortable. I told you once, months ago, about canceled calls. You said you'd handle it." He saw a flash of his own cowardice, a man who had preferred the convenient silence of delegation to the messy truth of family. He had accepted explanations that landed at a comfortable distance. He had allowed a filter between himself and the person who had taught him to tie his shoes and recite his numbers. "Why didn't you call me?" Esperanza asked her son, as if to stitch the open seam of years. "My phone stopped working. I left messages. I thought maybe I had said something wrong. I didn't want to bother you." The plaintive self-blame in her voice made him want to gather her into his arms and never let go. He had left a chair empty at a table because it was easier to let a presence shrink than to rearrange a life. For that omission, he felt an overwhelming cold remorse. He had not been the son he imagined he was. Adriana folded her arms and leaned against a doorway as if on a stage. "Convenience isn't a crime, Alexandre. Priorities are part of running a household. The house is our investment. You know the board's expectations. We can't have liabilities." "You don't get to speak for me," Alexandre said. The words came hot. He felt suddenly exposed, the way a man does when the armor of reputation thins. "This is my mother." "Your mother's expenses are not part of the balance sheet," Adriana said, then softer, with a flourish of narrative control. "I am protecting what we have built together." He thought of a time when they had been together differently, when she had laughed at his father's jokes and seemed to prefer the human moments, but that seemed like memory from another life. Memory is a pliant thing, he told himself, and dangerous when left unexamined. He stepped forward. It was easy to be fierce in an office over words. It felt different with a frail woman watching. "Take her inside, dry her off. If you must find fault with anything, see to her bones. She's been neglected, and that's on me, not her." Adriana's eyes flashed like the seam of a trapped animal. "You're naive. You're sentimental. You'll ruin yourself being sentimental. And if my role here is to protect this household against this, then perhaps I'm the one who sees clearly." "Get out," Alexandre heard himself say, the sentence worth more than he intended. He had watched men kick other men out of houses in boardrooms, articulated in cold language about futures and visions, but to tell someone to leave the place he shared in a marriage, no, to tell that someone to leave in defense of his mother carried a different gravity. Adriana's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. When she finally spoke, her voice had a practiced sting. "You'll regret this," she warned, and it was not much of a threat so much as an old language of leverage, social, financial, reputational. She had windows into those worlds. She had allies. "You will leave this house today," Alexandre said. He was trying to sound like someone who used words as instruments, measured and sure. In truth, his chest felt hollowed by the sudden authority of the decision. He could have tried to negotiate, to let compromises settle like dust. He chose clarity because this was old grief and it required new boundaries. Carmen crossed to his side as if to grant him physical support for his moral decision. She had been the silent warrior all these years, keeping faith with small ceremonies of decency. Her hand touched his arm. The contact steadied him. Adriana watched them with something like curiosity. "You'll throw out everything we've built because of sentiment?" she asked. The word "we" was hers to claim as if partnership meant compliance. "You are leaving now," Alexander repeated. "Take what you need. We'll arrange whatever legal things there are, but not here tonight." Her eyes narrowed. "You can't forbid me from coming to this house. It's ours." "It's not yours to behave like this," he said. "Not anymore." She opened her mouth, then closed it as if savoring some reserve. She moved toward the door with her head held high and a terrible calm. She gathered a small bag from the hall closet as if the bag could hold the dignity she believed she deserved. Then she left, the front door sighing shut behind her like the end of an era. The house seemed to exhale the second her heels stopped sounding on the marble. It did not become warm. The air was thick with a kind of shocked silence. Alexandra sank onto the nearest chair and felt the appetite of the quiet. He tasted it as a new obligation. "She will be back," Carmen said, almost as if reporting the weather. "She always tries to come back." "Not her," Alexander said. He thought of the thinness of apologies he had seen in corporate corridors. He thought of the small manipulations, the missed calls, the canceled cards, the wrong address at the wedding, and how they had been designed to make the inconvenient person shrink. They had worked, but they would not work anymore. He called Dr. Fernando, the family physician who knew their medical history better than he knew his calendar. The doctor picked up on the second ring, voice steady as a professional who had been privy to both triumphs and decline. "Bring her to the suite," Fernando advised, when Alexander explained in clipped sentences. "We will run a few checks. Nothing," he added careful, "nothing dramatic, but let us see the medication list." Carmen moved with the efficiency of someone who had lived in the home's margins and learned to renovate those margins into living space. She carried a spare blanket from a linen closet, warmed a pot of soup, and debated with herself whether to put on the kettle. She pushed back her sleeves and performed the ancient choreography of caregiving, heating towels, tucking the scarf, finding the pair of slippers that had not been thrown away. Esperanza sat quietly in the master suite as if the room itself were a gallery opening and she had been invited at the last minute. She looked out at the garden, where rain had left the azaleas looking like someone had given them too much attention. She arranged and rearranged the blanket over her knees like someone rereading a familiar line of a poem. "I should not have bothered you," she told Alexander as he hovered like a guilty landlord. "You always had so much to do." "You had no right to carry it alone," he said, and the words were clumsy and inadequate. He didn't want to make a theater of his regret. He had much to make right, but he had begun with a word and a house and a person who deserved more than his tardy remorse. "You are here now," she said, and her smile warmed one corner of the plan. She reached for his hand with a stealth of affection that had outlived much cruelty. "Tell me about the roses, the ones you planted when you were small. You were so proud." He had not remembered until then the roses. He closed his eyes and remembered the small fingers in soil and the way his mother had instructed him in patience. The memory steadied him in a way he hadn't known he needed. That night they ate soup that Carmen had warmed, and Alexander listened to the small stories his mother told about a city that had seemed bigger in maps than it did in heart. He watched the lines around her mouth shift as she laughed at a memory. Those tiny movements were payment for a debt he had begun to feel. Carmen sat across from him and watched too, and Alexander felt gratitude of a kind he had rarely practiced. He had been generous in meetings and sparing at home. In his office there were checks and statements, but here was a currency he had neglected: time and attention and apologies. He did not yet know how to convert feeling into action, but the thought of letting his mother out of sight again felt now like an impossibility. The next morning began with the slow light of a house that had made room for something it had previously confined. The staff moved as if toward a treaty. The atmosphere was cautious and hopeful. Franco, the gardener, pruned roses with the exacting attention of someone who wanted to see new life. There were little amends to be made, a letter to a health plan, an afternoon scheduled with a social worker, things that required the kind of patience the city board demanded he now give to life. Alexander's phone buzzed with messages that felt small and loud at once. A text from an associate about a meeting he might reschedule, an awkward invitation from an old friend who had not seen him in years. But there were also a string of missed calls from a number labeled law office that he assumed were less urgent. He sat in the study with a slow cup of coffee, the light finding him in stripes through the blinds. He had agreed with Carmen that it was time to formalize what had been informal. The house needed rules that would protect their mother. His mother needed a voice in the place that bore his name. The word trust rose in his mind with bureaucratic steadiness. He thought of their father's studies, the neat stacks of envelopes he used to tuck away in drawers. He wondered what had been left there in the neat order of memory, and whether the past had already spoken in determinations he had not heard. From the kitchen, Carmen appeared with a small box, a box of photographs and letters she had found in a drawer when she had been rearranging the bedroom for practical access. "I put them here," she said, as if presenting a peace offering. She set the box on the table and folded her hands the way someone presenting a truth to be handled gently presents it without flourish. Alexandre opened the box, and the smell of old paper and lavender rose up like history. A photograph slid to the top, his father, young and stern, arm around a woman whose face was all kindness. There was a small letter, the old man's handwriting disciplined and angular. He ran his finger along the faded ink. In the margin of another photograph was a note, "For hope." He smiled at the littleness of the joke. It made him feel like a child again. Carmen watched him as if determining whether he would be the man who would listen to the past or the one who would dismiss it in favor of spreadsheets. "There are more," she said. "I found some files in the desk. I thought you might want to look." He nodded. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to do the small thing right. He wanted to make sure his mother had what she needed and to write the ledger of his omissions. Later that afternoon, as the rain finally let up and the house began to smell of earth and warm tea, a message arrived on his phone from an unfamiliar number. It was short, formal. "Mr. Martinelli, this is Sonia Paz of the Paz and Rios law firm. We represent the estate of the late Emilio Martinelli. We are in possession of a document to be read to the principal family representative. Please contact our office to arrange." He swallowed. The name gave him a thud of memory, his father's papers. He thought of the drawer with the "For Hope" scribble and realized with a small, clean panic that there were legal things he had not tended. He looked at his mother and her small, orderly hands, at Carmen watching from the doorway, at the room that felt like a moth-eaten suit of clothes brushed into life. There were possibilities in that note, vindication, of course, explanation, closure. But there were also dangers. Inheritance is a strange thing to the living. It can clarify and it can wound. Some papers settle nets to keep people safe. Others rearrange loyalties like chess pieces. He dialed the number, and after a brief pause where the voice of a receptionist catalogued him in terms of protocol and appointment times, arranged for the lawyer to come the next day, a formal meeting, private, a reading of papers. Carmen watched him with a look that was almost maternal. "If it's your father's will," she said softly, "it might have things that protect your mother. Emilio loved her. He was not a man of many words, but he had his ways." Alexander nodded, but he tried to keep his face neutral. He had learned the hard way that anticipation is its own kind of agony. What he wanted, bluntly, was a clear legal line that would render Adriana's cruelty powerless. He wanted, more than anything, to make public what had been private humiliation. As evening folded in, Adriana sent a text. He read the words and felt a cold, amused pity for their thinness, a rehearsed apology mingled with a demand for reconsideration. He could have answered. He could have opened the door and let her back in with stipulations and compromises. For a long time he had preferred trade-offs to decisive action. He placed his thumb over the phone screen and pressed delete. The act felt conclusive in a way he had not anticipated. It did not feel like victory. It felt like a preliminary act to a larger moral accounting. That night, Alexander sat at the small kitchen table and opened more of the envelopes Carmen had placed before him. There were receipts and notes, and a letter written in a pen that had been pressed hard with care. His father's handwriting in an angular commitment spoke of small rooms and big fears. The word trust appeared again in a margin. There was a mention of a house, of maintaining a name. There was an instruction to put certain assets in a protective arrangement for the needs of an aged spouse in case of misfortune. But the legalese was mercifully simple, more sentiment than statute. He read and read until the ink began to blur. Each sentence moved him in a way numbers never had. The house was a ledger of living things, and his father's pen had tried to put some defenses in place. Whether it would be enough to stop people who wished to manipulate it, Adriana among them, he could not know, but the idea that his father had been thinking of his mother gave him a kind of moral direction he had lacked. When he finally went to bed, the house felt less empty and more complicated. There was work to be done. There would be lawyers and small humiliations to manage, and perhaps public scrutiny. He could imagine a town whispering and a few acquaintances choosing sides. He could imagine Adriana's friends having opinions about his gullibility. But what pressed like a new weight on his shoulders was the sense that he had been given a second chance to keep a person safe. He had a mother who had been made small by cunning decisions, and he had a staff woman whose loyalty outlived her pay. He had a house that could be a home again or a hollow monument. The next morning began with a bright light, the kind that makes everything clear and also makes flaws visible. The lawyer arrived punctually and, after the briefest of introductions and a small requisite legal murmuring, placed an envelope on the table between Alexander and Carmen. He was a precise man who used measured phrases to calm a room. He had no dramatic flourish. His authority came from the kind of wording you use when you want a generation to listen. "Before I proceed, Mr. Mortinelli," he said, "I will read the document as it stands. There are clauses that pertain to your mother's care. There are also certain beneficiaries noted." He glanced at Alexandra with a slightly sympathetic lift of the eyebrows. "Please understand I will avoid any legal jargon where possible." Alexandra set his jaw. He thought of the public hearing he imagined, controlled, formal, a final arbitration. He thought of Adriana's voice still in his memory, the precision of her cruelty. The house seemed to hold its breath as the lawyer unfolded the paper. He stopped there. The next phrase, the reading and the immediate legal consequences, would be a different kind of scene, the place where private humiliation meets public vindication. It was a place that would reveal in ink where loyalties truly lay. It was, Alexandra knew with a bitter clarity, the moment where many things would change. He felt, for the first time in months, a clarity of purpose, as if the house and the papers and the people humming in the small radical center of his life had aligned to give him one unambiguous option: protect, repair, restore. He looked at Esperanza, who folded her hands softly on her lap and watched the lawyer as if he were a man in a play she had seen before. Carmen bit her lip, posture taut with something like anticipation. Outside, clouds were parting, and a sliver of sun lit the roses that Alexandra had planted as a boy. As the lawyer began to speak, Alexandra braced himself for whatever the document would say. He did not yet know whether the paper would be the instrument of vindication he wanted or another kind of revelation that would demand harder choices. But he had decided already that he would answer whatever came with action, not avoidance. He would claim the work of making a home of this house, and he would not allow the person who had pronounced his mother an inconvenience to define them again. The first sentence slid into the room and opened like a curtain. The first sentence slid into the room and opened like a curtain. "If any person should require proof of my intention," the lawyer read, voice flat and deliberate, "let this document stand as testament.
I hereby declare that my wife, Esperanza Martinelli, shall be provided for in full through a trust created in her name. The family home at 12 Alder Lane, the income-producing assets of the estate, and a dedicated fund shall be placed into the trust for the sole purpose of ensuring her care, comfort, and dignity for the remainder of her life. My son Alexandre Martinelli is named trustee with authority to administer the trust for the benefit of my wife and to see that the fund is used for elder care consistent with this purpose. Alexandre felt the words as if they had been lowered into his lap.
The lawyer glanced at him with the efficient empathy of a man who had seen consolation and cruelty penned in equal measure. Carmen's hand tightened on the edge of the table until the knuckles blanched. Esperanza watched with a face that held a polite, almost disbelieving patience. "There is further provision," the lawyer continued. "A portion of the principal has been designated to establish a charitable program in the family name, the Martinelli Fund for Elder Dignity. The fund shall support initiatives that provide shelter, medical access, and companionship programs for elderly persons in need. Mr. Alexandre Martinelli is to oversee the establishment of this program, and staff members who have demonstrated loyalty and competence are to be given hiring preference and administrative roles." He paused so that the last sentence landed with practical weight. "The will also contains language asserting that the testator intended the assets to secure the welfare of his spouse. Any person who takes action to deprive the spouse of access to family, to materially interfere with her care, or who engages in manipulative conduct designed to exclude her from familial notice is not to benefit from the estate." Alexandre heard the clause about exclusion the way one hears a cut under the skin, precise and definitive. The phrase manipulative conduct had a moral crispness that seemed to single out more than one name. The lawyer's eyes flicked at Carmen, then rested on Esperanza with an oddly gentle gravity. "This wording," the lawyer added, careful to avoid legalese, "is meant to protect the beneficiary and to give the trustee discretion in ensuring the goals of the trust are met." He set the paper down and looked up. "Those are the substantive points." A small, strange sound left Esperanza, half laugh, half stunned sigh. She covered her mouth with one hand and then let it fall. Alexandre, feeling the floor of his life rearrange beneath him, pressed both palms flat to the table and tried to feel the room with new caution. "It names," Carmen began, voice low. "It names you," the lawyer said matter-of-factly, "and it includes a line recommending that Miss Carmen Duarte be offered a role in the administration of the charitable fund as someone familiar with the family needs." He tapped the paper where an older man's hand had likely trembled over his instructions. "And it indicates that the house is to be preserved as the principal residence for Madame Esperanza for as long as she wishes." For the first time since that rainy night, some piece of the unfairness that had writhed in Alexandre began to resolve into shape. It wasn't revenge. It was a mechanism, a hand the dead had put into the present to steady a wavering future. He thought of the missed calls, the canceled pharmacy card, the wrong wedding address. Emilio had foreseen a predator of sorts and had tried, with pen and will, to build a small law against that predation. He felt then an odd drift between conviction and sorrow, conviction that they'd been right to defend, sorrow for a life that had been small acted upon by another's appetite. "Is she—" Carmen started, the question an animal squeezed into human language. "Not named as a beneficiary," the lawyer said, avoiding any sense of triumph. "The testator did not leave any personal bequests to Miss Adriana Alves. The will names specific relatives and the trust. That is the document as written." He looked at Alexandra with a measure of sympathy that was more professional than personal. "If you need formal procedures to implement the trust and to move assets into it, the law firm will assist as required. There will be paperwork and channels. I can advise on that if you wish."
Alexandre closed his eyes for a beat. The relief that flared was saline and immediate. It didn't erase the months when Esperanza had been minimized, but it gave shape to an obligation he now felt ill-prepared for, the work of doing right administratively and attentively. He looked up. In the doorway, the house clock ticked as if to underline each decision with conscience. "Thank you," he said to the lawyer, and the word felt like a small prayer. Outside, as if on cue, a car door slammed, the front door opened, and Adriana swept back into the foyer like a woman whose absence had only sharpened her appetite. She had left with the day's dramatic posture. She returned with one equally practiced, poised as a woman who moved in environments that judged by fortune and gossip. Her hat was in place, her gloves immaculate. She stepped into the study and, faster than Alexandra could manage a private thought, she had found the scene. "What's going on?" she asked, intentionally light, as if she were asking for the time. The sentence was designed to flatten the room. "You should have left when I asked," Alexandra said. He had not wanted her here at this reading. He had not expected the legal paper to become a stage. But there she was, eyes bright with the knowledge that social ruin and fortune are currencies she had learned to trade. The lawyer made a small, neutral gesture. "Miss Alves, we were proceeding with the reading. This is a private matter for the family representative." Adriana smiled in a way that had been used to open doors. "Private for now," she said, almost glad for the theater. "I would hope anything that concerns the family would include the family." She stepped forward, inspecting the envelope on the table as if it were another accessory. Are we speaking about finances? Because you must know, Alexandra, if there's anything structural to be arranged, we'll need to consider our obligations." Carmen's jaw tightened. She had spent hours threading small mercies into a life and now watched a woman treat the arc of someone else's last wishes like a ledger line. "You're not a beneficiary," the lawyer said, succinct and without flourish. "The will is what it is." Adriana's eyes for a moment flashed. Then, with the manner she had acquired in rooms that taught a certain kind of ruthlessness, she moved into a smile that bespoke a new strategy. "Perhaps the will needs updating," she murmured. "People make mistakes. People change their minds." The lawyer's professionalism landed like a calm coat. "Mr. Martinelli," he said, looking to Alexander, "if you wish to pursue the administrative steps, we can guide you. There are processes to validate and file, to move assets into trust, and to ensure the named trustee can act. There are also options if someone wishes to contest elements of a will, but I would recommend caution and counsel in such matters." Adriana turned to him like a hawk scenting a weak point. "We will contest," she said in that low voice that had been used to declare intentions as if they were inevitable. "There are things families should discuss." "That is your right," the lawyer replied, "but the document as drafted expresses the testator's intention clearly. Challenges can be made, but He paused, not out of malice, but accuracy. "They can be lengthy and do not guarantee outcomes." Adriana's face changed as she absorbed the reality that the paper had stripped not only potential wealth, but the appearance of entitlement she had relied on. She had planned, in a way, for a life that assumed the house and its resources as parts of her path. The will had removed that assumption with the quiet efficiency of an old man's pen. She looked then at Esperanza, who sat with a composure that had nothing performative about it. "You have no idea how to choose," Adriana said, sharp as a knife. "This will, it's a manipulation. It's a fairy tale from a man who couldn't see the 1,000 things that made our life work." Her hand curled on the back of a chair as if to steady herself, and for a moment she looked more like a woman dismantled than a woman vengeful. Alexander's reply was a little steadier than his heartbeat. "This is my family," he said. The words were not meant for the lawyer. They were a summons to himself. "My father made a choice. I will honor it." You can't just appoint yourself the guardian of his sentiment, Adriana said, the tone of someone accusing another of vanity. You're not going to throw me out and into nothing. You are not being thrown out, Alexander answered. You chose to leave. You made decisions that harmed my mother. That is not acceptable. You will regret this, Adriana said. The old leverage returned as if rehearsed. People don't forget who you are in the city. You will find doors closed to you. He looked at her then with a kind of tired pity that was almost fierce. He will do what is right, he said. I won't trade my mother's dignity for convenience. Adriana's face hardened. She had not been able to turn the world on its axis before, and now the axis refused to move. Then you choose poverty of ambition over security, she said.
You choose. Choose what I choose, he interrupted. The phrase left him crisper than he felt. I choose family. She stood a moment longer, organizing a final performance, and then the fury of cogs grinding that had animated her for months entered her step. Without another word, she swept out. The door closed behind her with the faint click of someone who believes in comebacks. When the quiet returned, Carmen let out a breath that had been shorn close. The lawyer folded his documents with the same meticulous fingers that had unfolded them, and then he rose to go through the practicalities. If you wish, he said to Alexander, I can begin the initial filings next week. We will draft the necessary trust documents and coordinate with the bank and the register. He did not offer moral judgments, only the cold help of procedure. There will be signatures and notaries. There will be forms. If you need me to issue protective instructions to account custodians, that is something I can advise on, but for the moment, the document is clear. Alexander nodded. The list of administrative acts already looked vast in his head. Bank calls, notifications to accountants, perhaps even private security adjustments. It was the small acts of attention that mattered now. It was the kind of work his father had evidently tried to foresee with a pen. Over the next weeks, the house tilted into a new choreography. Lawyers arrived in subdued colors. Bank officers responded to formal requests with bland efficiency. Alexander sat through calls that made important small changes that made the difference between a life lived with options and a life left to the indignities of neglect. He signed papers and then, with Carmen's help, set up schedules for medication reviews, for regular visits from Dr. Fernando, for a circle of friends to drop by on appointed days. Carmen, who had always been house in motion rather than a fixture, moved into her new role with a quiet competence that had nothing theatrical about it. The firm offered her employment under the charitable fund's auspices and a coordinating role with a salary and responsibilities that for the first time matched the moral work she had always done. Alexander insisted, in the face of her objection, that she take benefits, a contract, and a voice on the hiring committee. She refused at first, saying she did not like paper, but then took the role when he promised the practicalities would not erase the intimacy of the care she gave. The local paper wrote a piece, gentle and tasteful, on the founding of the Martinelli Fund for Elder Dignity. It was short, a photograph of Alexander and Esperanza smiling under modest lights, a paragraph on the will, a few lines on the trust. The article mentioned Adriana only in passing, the kind of omission that felt like a social rebuke. Her name lost traction in a column where civic duty now lay. Adriana's response was predictably theatrical. She had social accounts with a network that relied on her presence. She wrote a post about betrayals and family conflict that read like a practiced aria of grievance. People who had once been allies at the country club rotated statements of astonishment and careful neutrality. Some called, some did not. The city is a place of choices, and choices are often determined by proximity to power. As the trust formalized, Adriana's proximity to the estate's power diminished. She tried in those weeks to make her case in the narrow channels she understood best: calls to mutual friends, quiet insinuations at social events where she had once been central. But the will had been a public and legal document, and public life cares a lot about proof. One afternoon, Carmen came to Alexandre with a small, tentative smile and a hand that held an envelope. Miss Abril from the shelter reached out, she said. She knows of someone who might help us organize volunteers. She says the hospital is interested. Call them in, Alexandre said. He felt an odd lightness now. The urgency that had once been a blade had calmed into a steady engine. Dr. Fernando mentioned a few community partners. Let's see if the clinic can help with screenings. What happened next was the labor of creating something durable out of shame and sentiment. Alexandre set aside meetings of investment committees and sat with hospital administrators in rooms that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. He learned with a patience he had not shown on conference calls how to arrange a fund that could pay for companion visits, for transportation, for small home repairs and supplies. The lawyers drafted a charter for the Martinelli Fund that stated plainly to preserve the dignity of the elderly by ensuring access to care and companionship. Carmen created lists with the meticulous kindness of someone who had learned to manage scarcity. There were rosters for volunteers, partnerships arranged for transportation with a community non-profit, a small house in the city designated as the first outreach point where nurses could meet with elder patients in a space that was not a hospital. They paired the fund with a local hospice and with Dr. Fernando's clinic to create a path for referrals. The first small pilot program served 10 elderly people in its initial month. The organizers made note of each phone call, each meal delivered, each hand held in the waiting room. Esperanza became, unintentionally, the face of the fund. She spoke at the first meeting with a voice that bore the quiet authority of a woman who had survived more than appointments could measure. She told stories about small things, roses planted in childhood, afternoons of soup and laughter, and the crowd, which had come for grant announcements and press pictures, found themselves listening as if to a living translation of memory. Among the people who listened that day was Señor Roberto, a neighbor from the old neighborhood who had known Esperanza at a distance for years. He had heard about the fund and come to see the woman who had inspired it. He was a simple man with flour in his hair from a bakery he owned in a quieter part of the city. He arrived with a plain bouquet wrapped in newspaper and a reserve of gentleness that startled the room. He spoke to her afterward with a modest directness. "I've known your name all my life," he said. "My mother used to say your stews were the only remedy for winter. I'm glad someone's telling a different story in this house." Esperanza smiled like someone who had been offered tea after a long walk. It was not the story of a grand romance. It was the beginning of a friendship that would grow into something companionable and kind. Roberto began coming by with bread, and then with small visits, and in time with invitations to community dinners. Carmen watched them both with a soft, pleased reserve. Alexandre found in the sight of his mother laughing at a joke about crusts a consolation that made the legal victories feel like scaffolding rather than an end. Adriana, sensing the social capital shifting, tried in the usual ways: calls, threats of legal action, a social media narrative that painted her as the betrayed visionary. Alexandre read one of her posts in a moment of private irritation and then, with the steadiness he'd been practicing, hit delete. He had found that action to be sacramental in a small way. To remove a voice from his feed was to remove temptation to reopen old wounds.
Weeks turned into months. The trust account moved money. The fund made its first grant to a community transport program. Codman took on the coordinating job with pride, hiring local women who had patience with hands and time. She set up a small room in the house where elders could come for conversation and tea. Franco and his crew rebuilt a part of the garden into an accessible walkway where wheelchairs could glide without obstacle. Dr. Fernando volunteered to host monthly checkups for fund beneficiaries. The Martinelli Fund, which had begun as legal language, became a small constellation of real acts that made life better for some people who had been invisible. Through it all, the newspaper wrote a few follow pieces. The will had been the seed, now there was labor. The tone was less about scandal and more about civic repair. People who had once been comfortable in gala rooms were invited to volunteer and discovered the small, stubborn joys of being useful. Adriana's attempts at influence evaporated into the public small talk that attends social falls. There was one moment, months later, when she stood on the sidewalk outside the house and watched people enter for a community meeting. Her face, which had been practiced for rooms and mirrors, lost its sheen. A friend touched her arm and said something too small. Adriana's defenses, for once, did not mend in time. She left without making a scene. Alexandre did not gloat. He had learned the ugly cost of letting a mother shrink. He had no appetite for public humiliation. When he saw Adriana's profile on a paper that reported on a new boutique she was opening across town, he felt nothing but a sort of private pity. People remake themselves. Some, he thought, do so with recognition. Others, he feared, do so without the capacity to notice the damage left behind. One quiet afternoon, as spring wound the garden into color, Alexandre found himself standing by the new walkway, watching Esperanza and Roberto sit on a bench, hands close but not clinging. Carmen crossed to them with a tray of tea and a small plate of cookies. The laughter that settled there had that roundness that speaks to small, recovered domestic rituals. Children from the neighborhood, invited by the fund for a story hour, sat on a picnic blanket while Esperanza told them a tale about a girl who once planted roses in a field and found in the soil all the reasons to be brave. The children listened, bright-eyed and totally present, tugging on the hem of a life lesson as if it were a treasure. Alexandre felt then the kind of quiet that is not numbness but fullness. The house had become a home in a way that had less to do with marble and more to do with obligation and time. He had found that the difficult moral labor, attending to what his father had tried to secure with ink, had not simplified his life so much as it had made it more honest. The Martinelli Fund held its first formal inauguration on a sun-soft Saturday. Dr. Fernando cut a ribbon. Carmen gave a short, measured speech in which she thanked not herself, but the small hands who had shown up. Esperanza, with Roberto at her side, walked slowly along the new path and paused to greet each volunteer. Alexandre watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling a strange pride that was tender and not performance. Cameras took their requisite shots. A local television piece later called the event a family's effort to turn misfortune into service. The headline sounded both more and less than the truth. Adriana watched from afar, and for all her attempts at reclaiming status, did not come. There was a dignity in that absence Alexandre would not claim as his gift. He chose in the months that followed to set boundaries that were firm but not cruel. When she sent messages, some plaintive, some demanding, he read them and did not reply. One evening, as the house settled into the dim of late tea, a notification lit his phone. It was a message from her, a line about "we should discuss" and the old grammar of entitlement. He moved his thumb slowly and pressed delete. The act felt like a final accounting, not revenge, not triumph, simply the closure you offer to a person who has had their chance. Carmen, who had been with the family long enough to carry memory like a pouch of coins, came to him later and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said simply.
Her voice was the metric by which he measured his unlearning. She had become not only coordinator, but part of the family's skeleton, practical, honest, indispensable. Months later, there came a small moment of reconciliation that had not been orchestrated. Alexandre received a letter from one of Adriana's acquaintances, someone who had known the woman before the marriages, and found in a long, frank note a confession about ambition and isolation. It was not a plea, it was a recitation of a truth that perhaps, in time, might open a different kind of conversation. Alexandre folded the paper and put it in a drawer with the other documents his father had left, an archive of decisions, choices, and their consequences. At night, he sometimes found himself in the garden with his mother, arguing gently about which roses needed pruning. She fussed at him for being too tender. He scolded her for letting him off the hook for so many years. They joked, they bickered, and the small domestic moments became the measure of a life remade. Project Esperanza, what the fund was now colloquially called, grew in modest, stubborn ways. They opened a small outreach center, partnered with local schools for intergenerational programs, and funded transport for elders to clinical appointments. Carmen ran volunteer training sessions where she taught people how to sit with someone who had lost memory without trying to fix them. Alexandre learned how to cut checks and to listen to reports without letting the transactional nature of his life eclipse the tender logic of caregiving. The work was complicated and sometimes thankless, and yet it carried a weight that felt right. A year after the rainy night that had cracked open the household, a small event took place in the afternoon light of the garden. There were children, sandwiches, and the low hum of conversation. Esperanza sat with Roberto nearby. Carmen moved among the guests, offering tea with a pride that was quiet and luminous. Alexandre walked to the edge of the gathering, found a bench, and sat down. He watched his mother tell the same story she had told the children months before about planting roses. Someone had recorded it on a phone, and later the video had been shared on a son's page. The comments were gentle, gratitude, a few memories from strangers who had also known shades of similar losses. He felt in that moment something integrated, an acceptance that mistakes, even terrible ones, could be met with repair, and that repair did not erase the hurt, but made space for new things to grow. There was, in the quiet after the party, a sense of forwardness that was not the arrogant promise of Adriana's future, but the patient tending of soil. The house ceased to be a theater of performances and became, stubbornly, a place where people came because there was something necessary to do, make life better for one another. In the late afternoon, after the guests had gone and the children had been tucked into cars with sandwiches in their laps, Alexandre found a small envelope on the kitchen counter. It bore a single line in a hand he did not expect. A note from Carmen that read simply, "We did something good." He smiled and put it in his pocket. Sometime later, there was a message on his phone from an old friend in the city, someone who had been distant for reasons that now seemed banal. She had seen the story of the fund on television and wanted to volunteer. He answered, not with the sharpness of businessmen, but with the invitation of someone who had finally learned what it means to be present. On his way upstairs that evening, he paused at the doorway to his mother's room. She sat by the window, the light soft on her shoulders, and Roberto was on a small stool reading a newspaper in the way men who are comfortable with silence do. Esperanza looked up and waved him over. When he crossed the threshold, she reached for his hand with the same old fierce tenderness he had taken for granted as a boy. "I am glad you came home," she said. He bowed his head. It was all the answer she needed.
He had come home to more than a house. He had come home to a responsibility that had both thinned his vanity and widened his capacity for care. At the edge of the porch that evening, after visitors had left and Carmen had turned the lights down like a benediction, Alexandre opened his phone. A new message had come in, a brief attempt from Adriana to reopen a door he'd already closed. He looked at the sender's name and without hesitation swiped. The message vanished into quiet. He closed the phone and looked up at the stars. There was a warmth in the air, the kind left behind by sun on stone. His father had left a document. More than that, he had left an invitation to act. Alexandre had answered. He had chosen the hard work of repair over the easy seduction of status. Below, in the garden, a child laughed at something small and bright, one of Roberto's artists in training, sketching a line of roses with a heavy crayon. Carmen, passing by, paused to smooth the blanket at the child's feet. Esperanza, seeing the two of them, leaned back and let out a small, satisfied hum. The house had been restored in a way that meant something more than marble. It had been made a place where dignity was not an ornament, but a practice. And when Alexandre finally turned in for the night, he did so without the heavy armor of a man who needed to be proved. He had become a different sort of steward, one who knew that a legacy is not only what you receive on a sheet of paper, but what you do with your hands and the people beside you. If this story moved you, share it to raise awareness about the dignity owed to elders and consider supporting local elder care programs in your community. In the months and years that followed, Project Esperanza continued to grow in small human increments. Carmen trained new staff, Dr. Fernando expanded the clinic's elder care hours, Roberto and Esperanza took Sunday walks and taught neighborhood children how to bake bread. Alexandre found that the constancy of small actions, listening to a neighbor, attending a meeting at the clinic, fixing a leaky gutter, addressed a kind of moral debt his wallet never could. He kept the old photograph of his parents in a new place, a frame on the mantel that no longer felt like a relic, but a witness. The house, on ordinary days, hummed with the quiet of lives attended to, the kettle's whistle, the rustle of papers, the soft conversation of people who had found, imperfectly, a way back to one another. There were scars, of course. Errors could not be wiped clean with a will or a fund. But the house, no longer a museum to arrangements and reputation, had become a workshop of repair. And that, Alexandre finally understood, was what legacy was meant to be. Not a ledger of what one had amassed, but the shape of what is left when you choose again and again to protect dignity over convenience. He slept that night with the window cracked open to the garden and the soft sound of someone from the neighborhood walking home. In the morning, he would sign more papers, answer more calls, and meet a volunteer for a new outreach. There would always be work to do. He thought of his mother, of Carmen, of the small boy who had planted roses in the dirt and been taught patience. The memory of that child steadied him like a purpose. He turned his face to the dark, let the house breathe, and at the edge of sleep carried the steady knowledge that some doors, once closed, remain closed not out of malice, but out of the necessity to keep what matters safe. If you were touched by this story, please like and share to spread awareness about elder dignity and the practical steps communities can take to protect it.